Are you new to ATEM switchers and wonder how to manage dozens of hardware and software buttons during a live production? Or are you a long-time ATEM user but you struggle with the complexity of automating the configuration to produce great results? You're not alone, and that's where MeanStream.io comes in. In this video, I want to introduce you to the app and its basic concepts. We will discuss the fundamental workflows and apply your knowledge to a small example project. By the end of this video, you will have the know-how to build your own show with MeanStream.io. MeanStream is an online application that lets you utilize ATEM native macros to reliably control your show. Instead of fiddling with XML code or individual macro operations, MeanStream allows you to think in terms of scenes and transitions. If you have ever worked with macros, you know how frustrating it can be to ensure everything is in the correct order to avoid unexpected results. MeanStream pushes macros a step further though. We aim to enhance what macros can do by utilizing them for smooth, beautiful animations and extending the capabilities of your ATEM switcher with functions that would otherwise be tedious to implement. I hope all of that makes sense and gives you a high-level understanding of MeanStream.io. Now let's see how all that works. Without logging in, there isn't actually much we can do, but we can explore the documentation to understand the application's inner workings. The docs are linked on the main page right over here. The documentation is comprehensive and covers everything from basic concepts to detailed instructions of individual functions. For example, let's have a look at the hypertext stinger transitions. There's a lot we can configure here and it's all described well, but we'll cover that in a later video. Documentation is great, but you're here so you don't have to read it, right? Let's dive into the concepts right now. In MeanStream, you think in terms of scenes and transitions. A scene is a set of configuration options for your ATEM like show camera 1 and enable upstream key 2. Transitions let you move from one scene to another, similar to changing slides in a presentation. Each transition results in an ATEM macro. So for instance, with 3 scenes, you will get 6 transitions and therefore 6 macros. ATEM switches include a number of native transitions, which MeanStream complements with 3 additional types, which we will cover in a later video. Projects are a collection of scenes and transitions that work together to build your show. You can create multiple projects to organize your events or reuse elements you have configured before. Now that we've covered the basics, let's create our first project together. Imagine you are a teacher in an online class. You need a scene to speak to the audience, you need one to present slides, and you need another to share your screen to demo something. Let's go and set that up. After logging in, we create a new empty project in the side menu. This takes us to the project settings page where we want to make a few changes to the defaults. First of all, we want to change the name. In this case, let's call it Demo Project. Secondly, let's tell the system about the ATEM we're using and its connected input sources. In my example, I have camera 1 connected to the first HDMI input, and my monitor is accessible via the second input. This will help us later identify the right sources when we configure our scenes and transitions. Okay, we're all set. The project is created and we've added some information about the wiring of our ATEM. That's going to be useful in the next steps. So let's go ahead and create some scenes. We start with a speaker scene. A new scene can be created by simply clicking the Create Scene button. This creates a new scene with default settings and takes us to the scene settings page. In the settings section, we want to give the scene a proper name. For the purpose we discussed earlier, a name of speaker seems appropriate. Now let's configure the scene in the video section. This is the heart of MeanStream, the place where you define the target configuration of your ATEM for this particular scene. We want the speaker on camera 1 to be shown in full screen. This is already selected for us as part of the default settings. We also want to apply some branding to the scene by adding a logo to the top right corner. We do this by enabling a downstream key. Since we have the logo as a PNG loaded into the ATEM's media pool, we choose Media Player 1 as the fill and key inputs. Finally, we need to make sure the PNG is loaded into Media Player 1. So we enable Media Player 1 and set the still number to 5, which is the slot number with the right image. This is all we have to do for our speaker scene. I will configure the other scenes in a hyperlapse to save you some time, but the concepts remain the same. Choose your main source, enable any keyers you need, and configure additional sources you might need to render your scene. Let's go. We have now created all the scenes we need and we're almost done. But we want to tune the transitions before we use the config in our ATEM. Switching over to the transition section, what we see here is the transition matrix. MeanStream generates a transition from each scene to each other scene, as we have covered earlier. You will find the source scene in the columns and the destination scene in the rows. To make things easier and less tedious to configure, MeanStream lets you configure a default transition for the project in the project settings, and we'll use that to transition between all the scenes unless instructed otherwise. We can see here the default transition is set to cut. Let's head over to the project settings and change that. Down in the defaults and templates section, we can configure the transition template, which is currently set to cut. Heading back to the transition section, we can see the default has now changed to dip. When we enter the screen share coming from the presentation scene, we want the transition to be different from the default. So we click the cell that corresponds to that transition. This already created a custom transition for us in the background, which we can now configure. We change that to wipe and keep the defaults. Coming back to the transition matrix, we can see that the cell isn't in that grayed out state anymore. This means we have successfully customized the transition. That wasn't too hard, was it? With all scenes and transition set up, we can now finally do what we came here for: generate macros that can be imported into our ATEM. The bundle is the set of configuration files generated from the current project. By clicking Bundle, we are sent to the code viewer with a list of files to the right and the code to the left. The ATEM XML file contains the ATEM configuration. Note that it contains only the macro pool element, so that you will only ever overwrite your macros but never any other configuration of your ATEM. In addition, if you're using Bitfocus Companion, there's a Companion XML with the necessary buttons and pages that allow you quick access to the right transition macros at the right time. Click the Download Zip button to download the bundle and find the files on your disk. Then extract the contents. I will leave it to you to read the documentation and learn how to import the macros and companion config if you don't already know. A little hint, you will find it in the section about bundles. Let me quickly import this config into my ATEM and show you the results. This concludes the video on getting started with MeanStream.io. I admit I didn't live up to the promise of animations and extended features, but we need to save some of the fun for future videos, right? In this video, we learned about the fundamentals of MeanStream. You should now be able to create your own projects and improve them step by step using the documentation or future videos I will provide soon.